Brian, you may begin.
Good morning, everyone. On behalf of the U.S. Commercial Service, we welcome all of you to the third part of a five-part trade finance series for Export Week 2023. My name is Brian Beams, and I'm the Deputy Team Leader for ITA's Financial Services team and your host for today's session. The producer of this series is Anthony Sargis. Today we have our partners from SBA and SBDC will educate you, the U.S. exporter, about exporting business plans when approaching your bank and finding new international markets for your for your small business. Before we get going on that, just a little bit of a reminder or what we're doing for the remainder of the week. Thursday, we have growing your export sales using grant funding, and then also on Friday, financing for small business exports. That's going to be a very good one in the sense of understanding your products and services or programs from the federal partners that we've been highlighting all week long. Just before we get going, just a little housekeeping items. Everyone is currently on listen only mode. This session is recording. If you object, please disconnect at this time. Participants can write in a question into the Q&A feature at any time during the presentation. We will leave 5 to 10 minutes before or for questions at the end of the presentation. Next week, we will send out the recordings and resource materials for all 5 sessions to all the registrants. Lastly, the views and opinions expressed in this presentation may not reflect the official policy or position of the U.S. government. I'd like to hand over the controls to today's moderator, Joe Raycraft with SBA's Office of International Trade. Joe?
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Brian, and thank you for Denise for being here. And thank you, all the audience, for joining us today for Export Week presentation on export business planning. My name is Joe Raycraft. I am SBA's Export Finance Manager for the New England region. And I come from a background of commercial lending and international banking. I've been with the SBA for about 3 years, and I work to promote SBA's export loan programs through direct outreach to lenders and exporters, as well as our resource partners. This week with Export Week, we've been building. We've got a 5-part series. As Brian mentioned, we did an introduction on Monday to government resources. Yesterday, we talked about export credit insurance, payment terms, letters of credit. So we're kind of building throughout the week, giving you kind of trade tools and strategies for doing more business internationally. On Monday, we also had Dan Pichet as our keynote speaker to kick off the week. And one of the things he said that I liked was to be proactive. And what we're trying to do this week, and Denise is going to do today, is we want to provide you with the tools and the resources so that you can be proactive, learn about these tools today so that when you really need them, you're not scrambling to try to put something together. Try to plan, be proactive, learn about these tools today, start putting them into action. So today, I'm really happy to have Denise Whitford with us, and she's really going to provide a roadmap for creating that export business plan that helps answer kind of that who, what, when, where, why about your business and how you go about going international. And she's also going to cover kind of that export readiness assessment. How do you know if you're ready as a company, as a product or service? So with that, Denise is a member of the National Small Business International Trade Educators Governance. She's based in Connecticut with the Small Business Development Center. She has more than 35 years of experience in business, consulting, and running a business. I've had the pleasure of working with Denise over the past 3 years that I've been here in Connecticut as Export Finance Manager, and she's helped a number of companies. So I'm really happy to have Denise as our expert panelist and speaker today on export business planning. Denise, I will hand it over to you, and I look forward to the presentation.
Thanks very much, Joe. I'm delighted to be here. It's always nice during Export Week, especially, to come out and really demonstrate what we do as collaborative partners with the SBA, the U.S. Commercial Service, and other partners like XM Bank. So thank you for that introduction. As Joe said, I am a business advisor with the Connecticut Small Business Development Center, and I really focus on as a generalist and looking at where businesses can get started and grow, and frequently how they can expand market penetration. And sometimes that's domestically, other times it's really helping those clients think about what if we went beyond the borders of the United States and finding a pathway to understand, are you ready? And if you don't know those answers, we help dive a little deeper to help you get more confident and more informative on what your options are. If we could go to the next slide, please. For those of you who aren't aware, we are put together by a cooperative agreement by the US Congress. Our funding, by the way, comes from the SBA, the state of Connecticut, and in our case, the University of Connecticut. And so we take a holistic approach in terms of how we put that strategy together. Some of the topics that I'm going to dive a little deeper into, as Joe mentioned, is an export readiness assessment. And then gathering the data and the information about market and industry, both locally, nationally, and internationally. And then we think about different ways in which we can get into those market options and do that in a way that makes logical sense. But while we're doing it, we look at how you strategize and demonstrate an action plan in that export plan of development. Does it make sense to your organization to do that? But does it also make sense in terms of how you'll secure financing? So if we could move to the next slide. When we start thinking about the different products and services that are able to be exported, I want to make sure that you're all aware that based on consumer demand and technology is really where we start thinking about how your product can be positioned, and is that technology necessary or wanted or in high demand, whether that be internationally or locally. So there are some fundamental reasons in which you can export. And again, that would be looking at, is it something that is an economy of scale? An economy of scale might be diversifying as well as looking at consumer risk. So let's stop with those two and start thinking about if you have a surplus of inventory and you don't have a market here in the United States, are there secondary or tertiary markets in other countries in which that product can be moved and exported? Could be in high demand in one of those countries. And I think that's a good opportunity for folks to look at that. The other option, again, when we think about your reasons to export is, we noticed, especially during national disasters or international things, what if your supply chain or your distribution channel is disrupted in some way? Could that be by competition, or could it be by an act of nature where there could be floods or earthquakes, or in our case, in the past couple of years, a pandemic? And so to avoid those domestic risks, sometimes, other than a global pandemic, moving that product or service into another market diversifies and helps you eliminate or reduce some of that risk. Consumer demand for the US. If it's US made, let's think about that. I travel quite a bit. I know some of my colleagues on the call right now travel internationally. Just about everything and anything that has US made on it is generally in a very high demand. And in many countries, they will say because it has the US label, it has a higher value in those markets. So let's think that through in terms of what you can do in terms of bringing additional revenue to your bottom line. Different conditions need to be in place clearly, and some of those conditions come back to, do you have the capacity to fulfill those contracts? One of the examples that I think about many times is I have a client who makes pet apparel. And believe it or not, pet apparel is on the incline globally. They got a great contract in Japan and could not fulfill it and had to delay that contract for about 60 days until they could get the raw material to put those pet apparel items together. So fulfillment capacity can certainly be your inventory and your raw materials. It can also be labor. It can also be product adaptability. Is that product something that's going to be accepted in another country? In this case, with the pet apparel, Japan was very open and wanted to bring as much of that product into that country as possible. If we could go to the next slide. Go ahead, Joe.
Quick question. we all think about, export products. Do you did you work with a lot of companies that are exporting services?
I have, actually. I have one that is in the marine industry. They actually serve as a sales rep for, I want to say, hundreds, if not thousands, of manufacturers globally. And what they do is they are a sales rep where they gather the information from various shipyards around the world, and they will put together as a sales rep packages to sell um, product, machinery, equipment, um, parts for repairs or new shipbuilding. Now, we think about that sometimes in terms of tangible products that you can hold in your hand, but this particular company exports their service and their knowledge. One of the
That's
largest ones, just to change gears a little bit, would be institutions of higher learning. UConn exports an awful lot of its services through its students, both international and domestic, where we go into other countries and share our knowledge, and professors also in teaching in those countries, or having those students come here, learn the information, and then go back to their countries. So consulting is another way. We have a lot of consultants in the state of Connecticut that offer their services, in particular in the energy industry and rebuilding parts of the world or starting to build parts of the world. Great question, Joe.
Yeah, no, it's a great point because there are so many service businesses, and sometimes we think, well, is that really exportable? But there are lots of different services. It made me think of a couple of companies that I work with that are really in digital services. They do like photography and digital kind of video for documentary work that they sell to media companies overseas. So there's really a lot. I know law firms do quite a bit of international business. So no, thanks for covering that.
Yeah, and I would say too, some of the things that come to mind were doctors and dentists and other healthcare professionals. I mean, the list goes on. So when we think about how highly educated folks are here in Connecticut, in particular between Boston and New York, it's a real hub of education, knowledge, and expertise. There's an awful lot of those services going across the borders, not just in North America, but globally.
You raise a good point. I mean, for the SBA, when we talk about international tourism, and you and I are here in New England, where we get a lot of tourism dollars every year. Well, from an SBA perspective, we do consider those exports. If you're a business that's selling to a company or even to tourists that are coming in here, maybe you have a tour agency, or again, like you said, educational. There's lots of different things where if you're providing service or you're selling a service to these international visitors, that's actually an export from SBA's perspective.
That's correct. Next week, I'm meeting with someone who's doing distillery work, and they're actually going to another country to discuss a potential partnership to teach how to distill different types of alcoholic beverages. So yeah, those are all options, and I love that because you get a depth and breadth of not just the hardware and the software, but the knowledge that can also be exchanged for revenue. It's a very exciting environment. Thank you for asking.
Thanks.
So in light of that, I want to transition, if I can, into the readiness assessment. If we can just stand on that readiness assessment and go back to, thank you, that assessment. I just wanted to share what this looks like a little bit, and I'm not going to read the page because even with my trifocals on, I can't read that print, but I can tell you what it includes. We look at the company readiness, but also the product readiness, and it's a short survey that could lead to a longer survey. And generally, I work with clients that are new to export. It might be their first time. They've been in business for a year or two. They're looking at a new market, a new opportunity. And we really want to look at a whole bunch of things. Do they have capacity with staffing? And as I mentioned earlier, is their raw product and their material, is their inventory ready? Do they understand what the financial constraints or restraints would be? Does the company understand import and export in terms of our country and the country that they're going to be exporting to? There's regulations, there's compliance. It also looks at their marketing, their positioning. Because someone finds your company by accident on a URL that's in the US doesn't necessarily mean that your URL for marketing your website is the appropriate area for you to be in other countries. So the 20 questions gets us through the very high level of those 4 to 6 categories. Are you prepared? Is the company ready? Does the senior management support this objective? Nothing worse than saying, hey, as a sales rep, I want to begin exporting to Canada or Australia or Zimbabwe. And suddenly management goes, we can't do that. We don't know how to do it. The capacity isn't there. But also the product readiness. In some cases, those products might need to be looked at in terms of how you can get into those other markets. In some places, for example, going into Canada, we might think, oh, it's right over the border. We can drive our product there. Well, yes, but there are regulations indicating that your packaging has to be in both English and French. Other parts of the world may ask that it be done in English and Spanish. The content of what that product is and the packaging has to read a certain way. Then you look at the cultural values. Do you understand what those cultural values are? In some places, your packaging may have color that is offensive or an image that doesn't make sense. In the United States, for example, we tend to do a lot of TV commercials that address cultural values and how you make people feel with your product rather than put on the package what the item is inside of it. You might be making plum jelly and you have nothing on there demonstrating that it's plum jelly. It might be somebody's face or an image of some other item in your factory or in your family. And people in other countries might not be buying it because they don't know what's in that packaging. So we look at a variety of different things in terms of what the values and the tastes are for those countries. You know, McDonald's and Wendy's and Burger King and other types of food and beverage companies, when they go into other countries, they realize that a Big Mac and French fries might not be the only thing that they want to put on their menu because the product needs to be altered so that people will buy it. And again, that concept of, is it one product alone, or can it be modified and generating packaging or a thought of how it integrates into that culture and those values? So that assessment starts with 20 questions, and we can elaborate as we get a little bit deeper into that area into about 80. And we don't do that all in 5 minutes. We certainly take the time to really do the evaluation with you or the team that you've assembled. If we can move to the next slide, please.
Before we move on, I just had I mean, this slide I think is so critically important. And Denise, you hit on it, kind of that management buy-in. Is the company ready is one thing, but is management or the owners, are they really committed to, you know, the international marketing, doing more? We all know it's difficult, right? There's a lot of things to think about, and you got your list of 20 questions here that could easily be extended to 80 questions. And you know, you talk about the language and the translations. It's hard, and this costs money. So typically your margin is going to probably be less doing business initially until that starts to pay off. But culturally, language-wise, like again, like are you going to be traveling there? Are you going to have a distributor there or a sales agent? And these are the types of questions that Denise is going to be asking. And you know, there's typically a time change. So how does the company deal with time changes overseas? That's an important consideration because there's going to be, you know, probably repair issues or warranty issues, and how are those going to be handled? And you need to be accessible. So again, I think Denise, you do a great job covering these things. And again, not to be a commercial for the SBDC, but you know, as you know, the audience on the phone is preparing for the export market, I encourage you to sooner than later start to learn more about the programs and services of the SBDC, because they really do position you for success internationally. So sorry, that was just my 2 cents to add to that slide, which I thought was great.
No, I think that you brought up some really good points that I can certainly go into, but this slide's much more colorful, so we can pause on this slide before we go into the market industry research. And that is, you know, not just cultural values, but time change. And that's really where we like to partner with the U.S. Commercial Service and some of our other partners in the chambers of commerce that are, the international organizations. We can't be all things to all people, but if you're poking around trying to figure out, should I export? What's this all about? What does it cost in terms of time, energy, money, knowledge? That's where we begin that assessment. And that's really the reason we start with the 20 questions and then we dig a little bit deeper. And in digging deeper, there are times where we'll reach out to Tony or Melissa or, the folks at the U.S. Commercial Service, and we'll say, I think we've got a client that's pretty stable and we need to be able to move them a little bit further. Can you help us on some due diligence? Is this a legitimate contract? How do we do the communication? Sometimes you need a translator, and that translator might be somebody who's with you all the time on every call. Sometimes it might just be materials, but we've got to be able to dig into that to make sure that you're prepared and connect you with resources, not just free ones, but ones that are going to be an investment in your company for the long term. So starting is very different than a seasoned company that's been in that area for a while. So good point, Joe.
Yeah, and I'll add to that because as we, you mentioned and I mentioned, the costs associated with doing business internationally. There is, some upfront costs involved, and this is kind of a commercial for tomorrow's webinar where we're going to talk about grant funding that's available for exporters. And Denise mentioned the U.S. Commerce Department and the various services that they provide. While most of them are very low cost, they still cost money. So you could offset some of those costs with reimbursable grant funding, which we'll talk about in tomorrow's
Absolutely.
webinar.
And I actually come to that a little bit in this one as well. So another area that we, overlap, in a really great way with the commercial service, also known as the U.S. Department of Commerce in many ways, interchangeably we use those words, is our market and industry research. And I put a few of the databases that we use, Vertical IQ, really to look at that resource library in terms of what are the trends in terms of what my product or my service is doing within particular parts of the country. How is supply chain impacting it? What are my potential buyers, distribution channels? The reports range between 10 pages and maybe 20 pages or so. And we work with you to digest that in terms of a strategy. So once we do the assessment, we start thinking about the strategy, and that's where market and industry research in a primary and a secondary level help in a great way. And of course, you see US trade, we've got a lot of different trade stats, and start looking at the national picture in different countries. You can really dig down in terms of how much of that product is going out, what is the consumer information, who are the major distributors or sales channels. We can also use Global Market Finder. What's the likelihood of getting into those areas? I've got databases like Euromonitor and TradeMap. There's a number of things that the SBDC can provide through this research that help you really think about, is this one worthwhile? What is the most likely to market that I can be in and degree of success? And then 3, how do I dig down deeper and find that relationship to get my product or service exported and get paid? And so again, we collaborate a lot with the commercial service. So we do the preliminary work, and then they go, several steps deeper into their own data and the international chambers of commerce. So how important is industry research? Well, you can do it by gut. You can say, I know that my product is toothpaste, and I know everybody needs toothpaste, but not necessarily. Depending upon where you're going, toothpaste is not always used in other countries, and the flavor of that toothpaste might be offensive. Mint is not something that everybody likes. It might be cinnamon. It might be flavorless. So I use wacky examples because I really want to impress upon you, because you feel that your product or service is demanded within a reasonable amount in your area, that everyone's going to take it as you provide it. Research is going to provide you with the hardcore data, the information. Out of 400 million people, how many buy your product? And you begin to realize how dwarfed that product really is in the scope of where you could potentially sell it. And then we also look at that research and look at the analysis in terms of, if you had a product contract for 1 million, whatever it is that you produce, can you fulfill it? And so the industry and market research help ground us in terms of real numbers. And once you get those real numbers, what is the likelihood of your success and how will you get there? Does that make sense to you, Joe?
It totally does. And, you're talking to, call a commercial lender. And, I always say that, this is the hard work that gets done before I see a loan request. So it is critically important. And I think, what you mentioned with, I mean, you certainly have these tools for market and industry research. The U.S. Commercial Service has, great market research services as well. And just to, once you go through all that, the local U.S. Commercial Service folks within the embassies are available. So they're the ones that are going to help do some of this research and fact finding. And what I find is, when I worked for a company internationally, we did a lot of business overseas, we had distributors, but every time I traveled, I would make it a point to meet with my contact. It was a good excuse to have a cup of coffee or lunch with the local commercial service person. Just to get to know them a little bit better, them know me, the business, what we're doing, and to learn, get some kind of that intel, that local, intelligence from, the commercial service folks that are, our eyes and ears on the ground. And just to get a sense of what's going on in the economy, what's going on in the market, things I need to be aware of. So it's a relationship with the U.S. Commercial Service that, not only can provide you with the market and industry research, but going forward, you can have a relationship with these commercial folks, and they can be really valuable relationships. And it's really doesn't cost anything. So
I would
again,
agree, and I
it
think
kind of
that
goes off on a tangent.
I think we're both coming at this from a very high level. Let me dig a
Yeah.
little deeper on this one too, and pick an industry that would require a different level of research, and that's going to be know your customer. If you're in the aerospace industry, for example, or you're selling to a government or a military entity, you need to know, are they on the bad guy list? And you need to make sure that you're dealing and trading in countries where there are no sanctions. So there's a variety of levels of market and industry research, but there's also compliance and regulatory thought that we have to keep on target there too. So it's not just, hey, look, I got a great product, I can sell it to whomever. But no, you can't, because sometimes there's embargoes or trade regulations that restrict that. So while I don't have anything on the screen coming to that point, I just want to make sure that when we say market and industry research, it's specific to your product and to your service to make sure that you're doing things that fit U.S. International trade regulation too. So if we can go to the next slide. Market options. I think this is pretty straightforward. It's a little bit deeper dive in how those reports would look and how we would pinpoint. And again, I mentioned this when I first opened up a little bit, is we want you to be very strategic and proactive. And therefore, if you're grounding yourself in legitimate research and data, when you're putting your business plan and your strategy together, the banker who's going to be standing by you is going to be convinced that you know what you're doing, and the likelihood of them getting paid back is pretty good if you've got some good research and you cite that in your business plan. But also how you chose the market that you want to get into. Is it because it's geographic? And I mentioned Canada, going over the borders to Canada or even to Mexico. What's the path of least resistance? Is there a generated relationship that makes it easier for you to get it there? Cultural similarities, language similarities? Are there economic needs? We might find that specific products or services, I mentioned energy, there might be countries that have to either restart their energy or build an energy plant, build a school. There's a variety of ways in which product and service skills can be exported, but whatever that market is, demonstrating why you did it. And that's where the demographic information as well as the market and industry information will help. And I referenced gut. We always joke about, it's my gut instinct. Gut has something to do with it, but I think most of us want to make sure that we reduce our risk and put the data out there. Analysis really gets you where you need to be sooner, better, and more appropriately. And it also gets that ROI, or that return on your investment of time, energy, and money. Again, I mentioned a few more tools and resources here with US Census. They have the global market finder. You can see how when you plug your data in, it pulls those little circles up and tells you where you're more likely to go. Google Market Finder. I don't know if anyone has used that. We did a series of this earlier in the year. Joe and I partnered with some other SBDCs and experts from both Google and Market Finder to pull information forward at no cost. TradeMap does a lot of things also at no cost. So if you're looking at where do I find this information, by all means, I'm here to help you and guide you, but you can tool around in the internet and pull these things up as well. And I'm happy to dig deeper with you to show you how to maneuver and manipulate, if you will, through those databases to find the information to make you more confident about making a good decision. If we can go to the next slide. Why am I talking about all of this is the good question. Well, we all talk about, my gosh, we have to have a business plan. I can't tell you how many times our partners say to me, I'm going to make a referral to you and they need a business plan. And that's okay. But I want to make it very clear, SBDCs across the country do not write business plans. We provide you with a lot of the tools and knowledge that I just shared. And our objective is to teach you how to manage and strategically direct your company, where to find that data, how to properly use it and leverage it to get where you need to be and go, but also assure that you stay in that position and you strategically shore up and move forward. We put these things together. Sometimes I make some editorial comments and I'll say, hey, say this paragraph this way rather than that way. Yep. And I do that when people go to get a bank loan. Secret is told. I do that with my clients. I'm a former banker. I can't help it. Put me in front of a client and a calculator, and I start, telling them really useful things that they can move forward. But the idea of the export plan development and how we approach that is, as you see on the little graphic there, is if you have an idea and a concept, whether you're starting your business or you want to move into a new market, what is that idea? We talked about the analysis and getting your research and analyzing what that research is going to do. We also help you forecast and then develop a solid plan that makes sense in writing. Well, once you've got that plan, can you put that into action? How do you implement that? And that's where we start to come back in and we start looking at your customers, your productivity, what's the financial capacity of the organization, because we all need money to get done what we need to do. You got to pay people, you got to pay for the electricity and the water to run your business, and then the marketing and all those other types of things. But how do you leverage key staff and partners? Sometimes your company can't do it all. You might need to outsource whatever you can't do in-house. How do you get the right organization or individual in place if you're outsourcing? Frequently, last week, I had a client that asked me, I need somebody that can be a CFO. I don't have a CFO. Well, there's people out there that are fractional CFOs that can dip in for a period of time and work through that strategic analysis with us, with you, and help you implement that. But they can also set your organization into a position where you can actually hire someone full-time to do it. Now that some of you might be scratching your head and like, I don't know why someone would do that. Well, you might not be able to afford a full-time person. And there's a lot of folks out there that do that on a fractional basis. And that means short-term or every once in a while that they step in. So that is possible. So once all that good stuff is done and we start thinking about leveraging your staff and your exterior partners, maybe there's a subcontractor that you want to be able to look at. What's the cost of that? How can productivity change if you leverage a partner rather than doing it in-house? We help you evaluate, is this working? And what modifications or changes need to be made to make that idea run that circle and bring you the return on investment of your time, energy, money. So the one thing that I have to say that we help you analyze is the standardization or the adaptation of your product as well. If it's not working, why are you selling it in that format? What would you possibly change? It might not be packaging, as we mentioned earlier. Maybe it's the efficiency of that particular product. And so when we start thinking about, are you doing these things in-house or outsourcing? There are a lot of key partners out there, even in the state of Connecticut. We've got Concept and we've got Turnaround Management. We've got a variety of different organizations like CCAT the Connecticut Center for Advanced Technology. There's a lot of acronyms. We help you sort through the acronyms and the partners to see which ones can provide you with knowledge, but also process improvement or even funding. In some cases, there's grant funding that can support what it is that you're trying to do. It's not always going to a bank. Sometimes banks work hand in hand with grant providers as well. So as I take a pause for a sip, I know, Joe, you probably have something to say about that.
Yeah, what I can say is this slide really makes it seem pretty not as overwhelming as I would have expected for an export, business plan. And, it seems pretty easy to kind of work through each of these points. And I know there are probably other points that could come in depending on the business, but for you, like, what's the typical length of a export business plan? Are we talking a 50-page document, or is this something a little bit more manageable that I can like work with and kind of up as the strategy changes?
It's interesting. As we started talking about this, the numbers of attendees actually went up. So I didn't scare anybody off by talking about business planning. So I'm delighted at that, because most times people come to me and they will say, honestly, I cannot write. I hate the idea of doing a business plan. And frequently what I do is I say, turn your phone on, record, because there is a memo area in your phone, and let's talk through these steps. So what I just did through the idea, the analysis, the forecasting, and so on, we walk through those steps and the various components. A business export plan or strategy is a living document. And when we do them for the first time, it's really intended, in most cases, to help the individual structure their initial thoughts, to help get a grant, or put the strategy together so the banker can understand. And then they realize as they're going through this, hey, this was really helpful. We asked questions internally and got answers and structured our internal process in a way that we need to keep coming back to this, because it makes sense for us to run leaner and smarter and more cost effectively. Joe, it does not need to be, and for everyone listening, it does not need to be 50 pages. This is not a PhD dissertation. It's really explaining what it is that you do, how you do it, and for whom, where it's delivered, and those steps continue. That can happen in 5 pages or less in some cases. It depends on the degree and complexity of the product, the market, the customer, and the channels in which you're going to get that product or service where it needs to go. Some people can do that in a very articulate way, very succinctly. Others, again,
Yeah.
depending upon the complexity of where they're going, might need a few more pages.
Yeah, and I like the way you described, just using your phone and recording it. I think
Yeah.
that's a great recommendation. And as a former commercial lender, I've seen a lot of business plans. A lot of times what's really effective is, putting it into a PowerPoint presentation. Maybe you have a 5 or 10 page plan. You can share that with the lender, but maybe when you're doing kind of a high level overview of your business for either your business partners, your business advisors, or your bank, it's really nice to have, maybe I've seen 10, 12 slide PowerPoint presentations that are very effective.
Yep.
To go through, and you talk through the business, and that's really all it takes. Yeah, there's a certain amount of work that goes into preparing that, but it's not, like you say, it's not a PhD dissertation.
No, it's not. In some cases, it may be, depending again upon the complexity of it. But recording the conversation helps, because then the client that we're working with can simply transcribe. They can send it back and forth to us electronically. We can make editorial comments and tighten it up so that it makes sense to the lender or the grant source. But
Yeah.
everyone learns differently and everyone communicates differently. Some are really good at writing and they're very comfortable with that. Others like to do, like you said, a PowerPoint. I've also used Live Plan, because there's boxes that you fill in, you type your answers into it, and it creates that document. And then the business model canvas. Everyone learns differently and communicates differently, and we meet the client where they are. So I think that that's an important tool to understand, that when you're doing export, it should be part of your marketing strategy in your business plan. But again, sometimes this might be the only component that you have to communicate why you need that funding or why your business where it needs to go and how.
Yeah.
So thank you. If we could go to the next slide, I want to be mindful of time.
Yeah, no,
I did mention the marketing action plan.
you're going to cover this, but you mentioned, lenders when you're presenting something to lenders, and my kind of advice that I've seen is you want to be clear, concise, and transparent about the business. That's critical.
I would agree.
I know we're going to talk a little bit more about talking to your lender and being prepared for your lender later on. So please continue.
Sure. So we talked a little bit about the marketing strategy and action plan. And again, that marketing plan, when we start thinking about, I mentioned URLs and, what's the difference between the way we marketed in 1990 to 2020. And we start thinking about localizing or globalizing or translating your website. And I don't want to sound drone about that, but if you think about web stats back to the 1990s, if everyone was born and alive there who's on the call right now, we had a very different industry at that time. I was a banker at that time. We used the internet very, very sparingly. In fact, in many cases, we weren't permitted to use it at all, except to communicate between offices or within specific markets. And today that has changed. And if you look at it from 1990 to 2020 and how those stats moved up, but then look at it from 2020 to today, and stats will vary up and down. And we did a study the other day or I read a study the other day on what happened during COVID when we were completely virtual and working remotely. So thinking about the difference in the way that stats can be used to market, how and why is having a really good website or a landing page so important, so people can find you where you are. But again, thinking about where you are and localizing versus globalizing that website. And I know that we work again with our partners at the U.S. Department of Commerce when clients really want to think about the differences in getting that website up and running. They have services that they provide to really guide the client. We come at it at a very high level. What is it? How do you do it? And here's some options that you want to be able to do. And then the technical advisors move that forward. Getting your company, your website globalized and localized is something that folks say, well, I can use Google Translate. Well, yeah, I guess if you're in a pinch, I was in Mexico 2 years ago with my daughter. We took a quick trip down to Mexico, and unfortunately, our cabbie did not speak English. Or I should say, unfortunately, my daughter and I did not speak Spanish very well. And she couldn't figure out which airport terminal we were going to, and we used Google Translate, and we were able to get the message across. But I would never want to be stranded in a taxi cab when I'm responsible for, say, 20 to 50 families having a paycheck that week and making sure that my business and my product or service were put where they were. So Google Translate, I think, works in a pinch, but having that globalization and the translation of the language and the culture for where you're selling your product is so critical. Can people find you whether you're selling in Japan or China versus Australia? Here in the United States, we use either Bing or Google, and those products or those channels of communication are very different. Some are monitored, some are censored in other parts of the world. Make sure that you're there and that it's speaking the language and the cultural differences that are there. Simple translation is not necessarily a good thing. So the web strategy, when you start thinking about getting into those other countries, what's your marketing mix? Is it your website alone? Do billboards work? Are they digital billboards? Are they, old-fashioned paper, cardboard billboards? What are they? How do you promote? And when you're thinking about e-commerce, your marketing strategy, you mentioned it earlier, Joe, was not just to get the product sold, but there's a time differential. How do you manage customer service? Because marketing, public relations, customer service all tie together in terms of, are you marketing a product or service and can you back it? So if you say that you're the best, what does that mean? Can you support returns? Can you support customer complaints? Or how do you deal with questions in customer service? So keep those things in mind that when you're marketing, you've got to think about what your vision, mission, and cultural values are. What's the product saying? What is your business reputation? And when you're promoting that, that marketing plan comes back full circle. Be aware of that when you're out there. I'm going to pause and take another drink. You look like you want to say something again, Joe.
No, just, marketing and, we're always looking for new customers internationally. And, again, going back to the U.S. Commercial Service, they can help not only identify appropriate markets, but they can help identify customers or business partners overseas. So that's always a good, again, a good service to utilize.
I would agree.
So that was my point.
I would agree. And I think it's not just what to do, but how to do it. And, demonstrating best practices. I think the tools that we provide at SBDC do that as well. The commercial service does the same thing. So I think that think about your action plan. It's not just the idea that you have a website, but how are you leveraging that with social media and then getting into the markets and again, dealing with that full circle of customer service as your marketing strategy, your promotion, and that mix. If we can go to the next slide. So this really gets us through the marketing piece of it. If we start thinking about, again, are you ready, doing the assessment, getting all the components of your research, putting the business plan and strategy together that includes the marketing. Now you're just about ready to go to the banker. And this slide is not intended for you to look at those numbers, but it's just an example of preparing to get to the bank. And of course, I'm doing this not just because Joe is our international trade finance expert, but most of us think about, show me the money. I need to know, where to go. The bottom line to me when I was in banking and doing commercial and consumer lending was, can they pay? Will they pay? And what if they don't? And I think knowing what the financials are, frequently, I also get clients that say to me, I don't know, you have to ask my bookkeeper or my accountant. My goal is not so much to force numbers into somebody's head that is not a numbers person, but the goal is to help decision makers be able to look at the analysis and understand where the numbers should be black and where they should be red, and if they should ever be read at all. But also being able to take numbers from prior in history, look at where you are currently, and then be able to have a conversation about where you need to go. And there's going to be a gap. But how do you fill that gap? And it's that preparation and getting ready to go to the banker to demonstrate you can pay, you are willing to pay. And if you don't rather, what do you do to close that gap? And that would be your collateral. So your credit history, your history of the organization is important. Your credit score is important. And demonstrating, where the gaps might be filled by collateral. What are your assets? What are your liabilities? We look at your profit and loss, your balance sheet, your income statement, and we try to generate those numbers based on reality and concept. And the example that I use here is I worked with somebody who had several Subway stores, and this was many years ago as a banker that I did this. And they had a dream when they first opened their first two. They did them collectively together, which was very brave. And they said that they could make X number of sandwiches, and the numbers looked fantastic. And I never felt that as a banker, everybody who came to me needed to show profit from day one. Because let's face it, when you're opening a business and you're growing it, or you're expanding a division, launching a new product, penetrating new markets, you're spending money. There's a possibility profit could go down. You could be negative. And as a banker, I always felt that was okay temporarily. But what was your marketing strategy to bring that back up? How were your sales going to go back up? Talk to me, have a conversation, assure me that that can happen. And so we went through this process and I said, okay, make me a ham and cheese sandwich. And he chuckled and I said, I can make me a ham and cheese sandwich. And he did. And I started a timer. And I said, if you're going to be working here with two people and it takes you that long to make one sandwich, how many hours are you going to be open during the day? And he went through the analysis and he went, I'm not going to meet those numbers, am I? And I said, probably not. We have to think about some other things other than ham and cheese sandwiches. And we're going to look at your costs and your overhead. Well, that sounds like a really complex conversation, and it was to some degree, but it took us a few days to build up to that. This tool is called our bottom line because if you plug really good data into your first couple of pages, it generates these types of financials. And you can see a cash flow statement here. We put all the raw product in, we put all these different numbers in so that you understand what it means to get to a cash flow. And also the same in terms of your balance sheet and your income statement, your profit and loss. Those things are all really important to understand. But we start at grassroots and teach you the fundamental basics not to be a CFO necessarily, but to be able to speak to it, understand it, and manage it. So if we can go to the next slide. In an overview, I think we're coming up near the end, and I want to make sure that we leave time for Q&A. There's a variety of ways to get to where you want to be in terms of exporting and expanding your markets. And I've put a few of those examples up here. Clearly, the SBA is one of our greatest partners. XM Bank is also on there. They can provide a variety of pieces of financing, credit insurance. There's a variety of ways to get to that. I think with the SBA, we've all heard about 504 and 7A terminology that's assigned to those particular clauses and creating those loans. And we also think about international trade, finance, lines of credit, working capital. And those are tools, again, to get you through that. And then XM comes in as a partner. If you're doing food and beverage and you're a producer, USDA might also have a piece of that or an opportunity to work with you as well. And I've mentioned credit, export credit insurance. Factoring might not be for everybody, but factoring can certainly help you, or asset-based lending where you've got a receivable but you don't have enough capital to get it going. There's a variety of ways in which that can happen. Again, credit insurance can reassure you, or an equity partner that's going to come to the table. No matter what it is, it's all about your capital. And that prior slide really helps us help you determine which is the right partner. The one thing I did not put on there was grant funding, because grant funding comes and goes. It depends upon what the need is, and it's very specific, again, in terms of is it machinery and equipment? Is it for workforce? There's a variety of ways that we would be able to stay current and get that. But again, supply chain, sales, financing is really what we wanted to come to the point of on this slide, and understanding that you're not alone, that we can certainly bring the right partners to get you to where you need to be, including getting letters of credit or any other kind of international FX, the foreign exchange. There's partners that come to the table, and we're happy to help you navigate those waters. If we can move to the next slide. So before we come to conclusion, I do want to point everybody to a valuable tool that I use all the time. Mine looks terrible. If I had it near me, I would show it to you. I got little tabs on each of the pages. This export business planner is probably one of the best tools if you ever want to become a certified global business professional, or CGBP. Joe mentioned that I am part of NASBITE, which is the National Association of Small Business International Trade Educators. That's a mouthful, but I sit on the governance committee. And when I studied to take my exam, it's a 2.5-hour exam. It was very difficult, but this particular tool, this export business planner, was instrumental in teaching me a lot of the basics. You can dive as deep into this as you want to, or use it again as a clear reference. I would encourage each of you to look this up online and pull it. It's a great SBA tool. It gives you a lot of pointers. It gives you a lot of really good step-by-step analysis and information. Pulls everything together that we've already talked about. And I think in summary, we really base our knowledge and our manner in which we communicate in standardized ways. Again, there's lots of other tools to help you and your team get educated, dig deeper, those resources to understand how to get where you need to go. If we could go to the next slide, please. In summary, I'm happy to help you with your assessment and your planning, as well as market and industry research, helping you get your marketing strategy set up and website design. I collaborate a lot with our partners here, and to get that delivered to you and move you to finance preparation. We work with every bank and lending institution, including community lenders. There's no business that's too big or too small. We just did a food and beverage export summit. It was a half-day event that we did in person. I think the first one I've done since COVID has come to its cycle in which it is now. And it was great to get out there. It was very well attended, but we started looking at all the options and getting the finance preparation out there, and including food and beverage. So just keep that in mind. If we can go to the next slide, I want to share with you how to find me. at ctsbdc.uconn.edu. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. We're also on LinkedIn. So with that, I want to see if there's any questions in the queue.
Thank you, Denise. Wow. Always a plethora of information. It almost seems like every statement you say, obviously by design, is important. But yet you do it in a precise and concise way. I love it. So